I think there is this demand from a lot of racial justice folks that politicians adopt this sort of denunciatory language that many people on the race left use, that politicians denounce white supremacy and institutional racism and systemic racism. On that level, I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake partly because it's a losing message. I also think it's a mistake, and this may be more important to a lot of racial justice folks. It's a mistake because it's not the most compelling analysis of racism out there. We are not fighting white supremacy right now. That's not what we're fighting.
We're fighting.
No, but it's a huge mistake to think we are. What we're fighting is racism as a class weapon that is succeeding in driving racial conflict, even among people who would absolutely and genuinely repudiate the idea that they are white supremacists. We just need to be right. So I'm making on this side when about the race left, I'm making two separate claims. One is the analytic claim. The model of racism that the race left is using is wrong. Racism is not fundamentally a conflict of white over non-white. It is fundamentally a weapon of power that succeeds by promoting white over non-white conflict. The white over non-white conflict is there. I'm not denying that. It's real, it's powerful. But the main impetus for it is the power that people generate through it, right? So it's an analytic claim, and then it's also a messaging claim. Yeah. When we denounce white people, we actually do the racial right, we do the economic royalists a favor. We confirm their story about America. They're saying, hey, white folks, we're locked into racial conflict, pick a side. And if the race left turns around and says, we need to denounce white racism, white supremacy, white supremacist culture, the race left has actually said, hey, white people, we're locked into racial conflict, pick a side, right? So that's one critique. But I want to shift for a second to like the Chris Rufos, right? The attacks on critical race theory, the Tucker Carlsons, the Laura Ingrams. What are they doing? This is incredibly important because this is going to dominate in 2022. They are using language to scare voters. And in that context, they're picking up terms like critical race theory or the 1619 Project or the Black Lives Matter movement. And they're saying, you know, all those folks asking for racial justice, they don't actually want racial justice for communities of color. They want racial revenge. Be afraid, white folks. Be very afraid. Because when they say racial justice, they mean hate white people. That's the rhetoric. And does it matter what somebody, like I've been associated with critical race theory my entire professional life. Do they really care what I'm saying? Not really. They just want a snippet in which I say something like whiteness is a problem, and then they're just going to run that 24/7.
Yeah.
Right? So they're going to try and weaponize it. How do we deal with the weaponization of our efforts to promote racial justice? It can't possibly be that the way we deal is to say, well, we should stop talking about racial justice. That can't possibly be. Rather, and this is the race class fusion move, rather, the strategy has to be to name what they're doing and to make clear we're all better off when we reject the lies. I'm not teaching hatred. Most school teachers are not in the classroom teaching the children that they want to thrive, teaching them to hate each other and to hate the country. That's a bunch of baloney. What's actually happening is a lot of us are working to create a multiracial society in which all of us can thrive, and some people profit by lying about that, by stoking division and hatred. And when we recognize and repudiate those lies, when we look at Chris Rufo and we say, you're a liar, you're a self-proclaimed liar. He has boasted about lying about critical race theory. And why? Because he got a gig out of that at the Manhattan Institute. And who is the Manhattan Institute? What is it? It is an institute that it describes itself as promoting free market ideas, which is to say low taxes and low regulations on corporate America. They are funding Chris Rufo, who is lying about critical race theory. When we're all clear about what the game is, that racism is a strategy of division promoted by the very rich, that's when we can pivot and say, okay, let's build that cross-racial solidarity. And here I just want to tie this all back together. You want to actually build cross-racial solidarity? It can't be inane. It can't be thin. It can't be superficial. It requires that we deal with racial inequities, that we repair the damage racism has done. It requires that all of us, white people and people of color, examine the attractions of whiteness in our own lives and work hard to make sure that we're rejecting whiteness as an ideology of racial supremacy and instead embracing a commitment that almost all of us share on some level towards racial egalitarianism. In other words, yes, okay, we need to create a cross-racial solidarity. We need it because it's the only way we're going to save our own families, whether our families are white, black, brown, Asian, Muslim, Native American, doesn't matter. The most direct threat to all of our families is racial hatred being actively promoted by the very powerful in our society, by some of them. And the only way we're going to create actual cross-racial solidarity is by dealing with the racism in our society.
I think that is enormously powerful, and it seems to me the obvious move. And it is also true that I speak to people all the time on this podcast and elsewhere, people who are arguably farther to my left and more radical and have read many more leather-bound books than I, who really reject the idea that anything less than the denunciation and a kind of race-first approach, address racism first, cure racism first, is anything other than betraying the interest of historically marginalized groups.
I love that. Let's come back to the conversation about defund the police.
Sure.
Okay? Because I think this is a way to have this conversation. Let's say you go to the American public and announce that you want to defund the police. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen? You're going to lose elections, which means you will not be able to put into place politicians who will actually defund the police, which is to say, and so police are actually probably going to get more funding.
So,
right?
By the way, that's not that's not my argument or my take about defund. What ends up my view of defund is that if you don't like it, if you think the words are problematic, even if you support the movement and the underlying ideology, don't use the words. Don't use them. But my objection was to the fact that there are so many people who are ostensibly on the left or leftist who take the minimal amount of time that we're given in the public sphere and public media to denounce, to bring up and denounce defund the police when they could simply avoid it. If they have to talk about it, use that precious airtime explaining that defund is in fact this policy agenda that polls very well when you describe what it actually is, instead of doing this thing that I think some leftists do, which is to show that they are like real, they're savvy, real politicos by throwing a term under the bus, which is largely, in most contexts, just used by activists in communities that have a better sense of when and where is it appropriate to use the term on a person-to-person basis.
But we are talking about these activists. And I guess, right, when you say that you've been talking to people on your show who are convinced that we must denounce white racism, we must denounce white supremacy, that has become a sort of a litmus test for how radical you are, how committed you are.
For some activists, but Professor, there's two tiers of activists.
But I want to focus on the activists for a second. I really want to talk to these activists. I want to talk precisely to these folks.
But can we be clear, though, that there's two tiers of activists? And when I said I trust the activists using defund in the communities, I'm talking about actual grassroots organizers. I'm not talking about, no offense to anyone in particular, but Patrisse Cullors or any of these kind of celebrity activists who have podcasts and stuff and buy $1 million houses. I do think that there's an incentive for them, along with the media class, to use the most inflammatory language and be looking for condemnation over actual substantive results. But I do trust people who are community members who know not to go up to grandma in church and say, let's burn it all down. But that there are people who are rightly galvanized by that kind of language and to use it judiciously.
So, I don't want to question people's motives. I want to take it not at face value, but I really do want to talk to these activists, partly because I'm coming from that tradition as a scholar. But as a scholar, what were my priorities? my two priorities, racial justice for communities of color, and also speaking persuasively about what's happening in terms of racism to communities of color. Because I think coming out of the Latino community, lots of folks don't really understand how racism's working, right? So my priorities as a scholar were racial justice for communities of color, speaking persuasively about racism to communities of color. And I think that a lot of racial justice folks have those two priorities. And I want to say, great, hold on to those priorities. Now give me a second, because I think a paradigm change will help us achieve both of those priorities better. So if your priority is racial justice for communities of color, and your strategy for achieving racial justice for communities of color is the language of abolish and defund, you're kind of pre-committed to the idea of not being able to achieve racial justice for communities of color, because you can't win elections that way. And if you can't win elections, our country will be run by politicians who are actually increasing funding for police, who are actually encouraging a culture of police violence.
Professor Lopez, aren't there objectives that are other than electoral objectives? Because the many organizers say, and I don't disagree with you from an electoral context. This is why I'm saying that there's just different language for different places and different goals.
But the reason so many activists have given up on the electoral context is because they've adopted a strategy in which they're going to lose electorally. Right? It's not like somebody walked in and said, well, I could win elections and elect politicians who would actually change all this shit, but I don't want to do that. Nobody's saying that, right? People are saying we can't win elections. What are the alternatives?
But it's also because,
language of abolish, let's be clear, part of the language of abolish is defended on the idea that we can't actually achieve much, so let's dream other possibilities.
Right. Well, abolish and defund, again, are different, and I did not bring abolish into this particular conversation. But also, I just want to also flag that there are a lot of people who've given up on electoral politics because where it has been successful, we have gotten people elected to office, there's a perception among some that they haven't used their leverage to sufficient result. And there is no guarantee. There seems to be no hopefulness that if we did get 50 more AOCs, that it would actually meaningfully change anything, because there's been a lack of demonstrated willingness to be as antagonistic to the corporate Dems.
I love that example. Don't you think it would make a huge difference if we did get 50 more AOCs? Especially, for example, at state levels.
No, but a lot of people don't believe that's the case, because unless you get a majority of the House, as opposed to just more, which again, maybe you think that that's an incredible, unlikely scenario, especially in the short term, that we need to affect climate change, climate reform, and all of these kinds of pressing issues. That because we have seen that it takes so much time to get there. Nancy Pelosi, in some people's view, used to be the AOC of 30 years ago, talking about how much we needed Medicare for all. And these systems have sure, she had a very different profile, of course, than AOC. She's always been an affluent person whose power came from moneyed interest.
Right.
And including her own familial situation. But that the case is made that the longer you're in Congress, it tends to be the effect tends to not be in the left direction, pushing you in the left direction, right? And so there is a skepticism that I think is healthy that people have.
I understand that. I understand that. But I'm not arguing that electoral politics is the be-all and end-all. But I am arguing, I think, that if we had politicians who were committed to racial justice, that would be far better than having politicians who got elected on themes of racial threat.
Well, sure,
right?
of course.
And again, I want to come back to this idea that activists are committed to racial justice, to practical racial justice for communities of color, insofar as they can achieve it, and to speaking persuasively to communities of color. And I want to say, adopting a politics that says, we need to denounce white racism means that we will continue to see politicians elected whose main campaign message is people of color are a dangerous threat. And in addition, that sort of language is not especially compelling to communities of color.
Right.
When you actually go out in communities of color, and I say this having run focus groups, people are really overwhelmed by the idea that they are beset by systemic racism, that they're widely hated, that their children will never succeed. Like, that's a struggle for people to hear that. Whereas a message that says we're all in this together and we're being divided by race, let's join together. I've run messages like that, framed around criminal justice reform and framed around immigration reform, that actually win among persuadable voters, that actually win among white voters. This is important. In other words, those messages could actually win elections and help elect politicians who, at least in their speech and at least in their campaigning, emphasize cross-racial solidarity and ending racism and racial harms against communities of color.
Yeah,
and also, let me just finish this. Those messages of cross-racial solidarity are the most popular messages among Latinos and African Americans.
Yeah.
In other words, to the racial justice folks, I would say, shifting to a paradigm of racism as a class weapon is actually a more promising route toward racial justice for communities of color, and also a more compelling way to speak to communities of color. Right? It is not throwing communities of color under the bus. It's not a betrayal of those communities. It's actually a more promising route toward practical racial justice.
I agree with you, but they do not. And I can't, I don't mean to, I keep steel manning their argument because they're not here. And I don't want to, name names when they're not here to defend themselves in their own view. But people who listen to this podcast can probably guess who I'm talking about when I say folks are just not going to, they do not believe you. People don't believe me. People, other Black leftists, some look at me with a great degree of deal of skepticism because they don't see anything short of demanding condemnation, denunciation. They don't see anything short. They see it as catering to whiteness, caping for whiteness, centering whiteness is a big one. You're centering whiteness. My Lord, how many white people do you think live in America? This is a country that's 70% white. I'm not centering whiteness, but I sure as hell am going to pay attention to what white people think in my messaging in a democracy. I mean, who is it for that you're beating your chest and acting like you're big and bad and Fred Hampton or something because you're like using the most aggressive language to describe white people in the world? Like, who is this for? Like, I'm glad that it makes you feel good around the Thanksgiving table with your aunt and uncle when you feel powerless in the world. And I'm with you. Like, yeah, let's talk about how frustrated we are about racism in private. But this is the real world. And my job is to talk to everybody, not just a sociology class or whatever.
No, I'm so glad. I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned Fred Hampton, right? Because Fred Hampton is the paradigm of the radical freedom fighter who understood that racism was fundamentally about power and threatened all of us.
Correct.
Right? But here's the other thing I want to say. Maybe partly because I'm coming out of this tradition, I'm actually really sympathetic to the people who say, we need to denounce whiteness. We need to tear it down.
I get it.
We need to denounce white supremacy.
I get it.
And I think
I just don't agree with it.
Well, I think that this is why I keep coming back to this notion of a paradigm change. And part of the reason I'm using the phrase paradigm is, as we know, new paradigms are difficult. It's a whole new way of thinking about the world, and we continually default to the older way that we're comfortable with. And it's hard to shift. It took me years to shift. But the paradigm is actually one with a long tradition, a long pedigree from our most radical freedom fighters. And I think Black, but also brown. I think about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta when they're trying to organize farm workers in California. They said, this must be a multiracial movement, because racial division is a weapon of the growers, right? Like our most radical freedom fighters understood that you couldn't think about racism without thinking about power and capitalism. We need to shift back to that. And it's hard to make that shift, precisely because so many times those of us fighting for racial justice are told, you're divisive, you're the problem, tamp it down, quit talking about it, we'll get to racial justice later, right? I mean, that's the main message from the Democratic Party. We'll get to racial justice later. Quit distracting us. You're the
Right.
problem. I'm not saying that at all. I'm coming at this from the opposite. I'm coming at this from the direction of, I want racial justice for communities of color. I want to speak persuasively to communities of color. How do we do that? By recognizing that racism is actually fueled, funded, supported, promoted by some of the most powerful actors in our society. And only by building a multiracial coalition in which white people have an equal role can we create a racially egalitarian society for all of us.
People aren't going to like
insight.
that, but I love it. But people aren't going to like that. Let me ask you before we wrap, because you've been so patient with your time, and we've already been here for over an hour. As someone who did come up with, under Derek Bell and understands probably what, critical legal theory is better than 90% of the people who like to offer opinions about it on TV or in print. Do you think it's going to continue to have an effect, this discourse around CRT, regardless of if it's properly defined? It's kind of interaction with, I think, some sincere anxieties about school closures and children's education. Do you think it's going to have a continued effect as we go into midterms? And what would you recommend to Democrats as the best way to manage that messaging battle?
It's going to be huge. It's going to be huge. But not because of what critical race theory is in fact, but rather because of the way it's been demonized. Mm-hmm. In 2022, the main right-wing message, and by right-wing I mean from Fox News to Steve Bannon to almost every elected Republican official, the main message is going to be racial justice activists are motivated by racial hate. They hate white people. That's what this is about. They want to burn down the country. They want to burn down mainstream. They want to turn people against each other racially. They want to promote racism. That's going to be the main message. And now Democrats need to figure out how to respond. There's going to be a set of folks on the race left who are saying we should denounce that as white supremacist language. That's going to backfire. In fact, it's going to seem to confirm the right's message. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a set of folks like, sort of along the Terry McAuliffe model, who are going to say, oh, wow, we need to get away from that language as quickly as possible. So we should issue a technical defense. Critical race theory as a graduate level set of ideas is not, in fact, being taught in elementary school. And then we should pivot quickly to policies, all the good policies that Democrats are going to do. That's going to fail as well. What the right is saying is there's dangerous people pounding on your front door, teaching hatred of your children. If the left responds by saying, well, that's not technically true, but anyway, have you heard what we're going to do in terms of home insurance rates? Good luck, right? What is the way forward for the Democratic Party, but also for the race left and the colorblind left, to pivot to this paradigm of seeing clearly that racism is a strategy to divide us, including the idea that those of us talking about racial justice are in fact promoting racial hatred. And to say, you know what? That's a lie. And you got to understand where that lie is coming from. That's coming from people who profit when they lie and promote racial hatred.
That's so compelling. The Manhattan Institute framing, I think, is very constructive. You're right. It does add a sense of motive that elevates it from a defense that you were forced into making to an affirmative argument about the world works that is a strong enough script to replace the one that the right has already interjected into the conversation.
Another way to think about it, I think that's so right to think about it in terms of scripts and stories. The right is saying, hey, America, you're under threat from dangerous, angry people of color. And the truth is, we as Americans are under threat. But it's not our neighbors of different colors or different religions or different immigrant status. It's the reactionary elite who would rather trash democracy and sow social hatred so that they can hoard more billions. We are under threat. Tell that story. tell the story of where the threat really comes from in our lives and how all of us are better off recognizing that the idea that we're the threat to each other, that's the lie. And that in fact, the only way forward, whether we're white, black, or brown, the only way forward is to reject the lie and build power with each other so that together we can defend ourselves from the reactionary elite rigging the system for themselves and stoking hatred among all the rest of us.
I really appreciate this. And I'm very happy for, patrons who have subscribed and listened to this. And we're going to have to make a big chunk of this free because I just think this is such an important conversation. Just the last thing I wanted to ask you about, if I could, is this, the articles and, reporting that recently came out of this Jacobin study about what the Democrats should do next. Are you familiar with this? There was an article in The Guardian by Matthew Karp, friend of the show, and Dustin Guastella, that offered, I think, some advice that was similar to what you're offering here. Although many people on the left, it feels like, have taken it up as a kind of argument that we need to just pivot to policy in a way that you don't recommend. Yeah.
I think that there's a couple of different insights about race. There's the sort of negative and affirmative. The negative is, hey, denouncing white supremacy alienates a lot of people. That's right. Now, what happens is that a lot of people stop there and then they turn around and say, so let's not talk about race anymore.
Right.
That's an enormous mistake. And I think the Jacobin kind of analysis had a flavor of that, which is like, hey, this language we're using isn't working. Let's drop it. Whereas what I'm saying is, let's replace it. Shift the paradigm. Don't shift away from racism. Racism is, I want to say this very clearly, racism against black and brown people is the number one threat in the lives of every American family, white families included. It is the number one threat. Racism against black and brown people is the number one threat in the lives of every family in America.
Do white people believe that when hit with that message? Or do white people go, oh yes? Or do they like how on earth does white racism against a black person hurt me? Because I get the argument. Heather McGhee came on here and explained drain pool politics. The example being, if you hate black people so much that you shut down your community pool, that hurts white people too. But isn't that a bit of an abstraction for the average white voter to take in?
Divide and conquer politics. It's not an abstraction. People understand it. And on what basis are we being divided? Race, gender, transphobia, religious bigotry. It's divide and conquer politics. And when you say divide and conquer politics to voters, white, black, and brown, they get it. They know it. They recognize it. That's the threat. And that means we must address racism. But address it as divide and conquer politics. Address it as a strategy of the powerful, not as this sort of white problem that none of the rest of us are involved. No. Racism threatens every one of us because it's an effective divide and conquer strategy. They divide to conquer. We unite to build. We unite to build. And on what basis do we unite? Expressly across those lines they most try to divide us on. Along race, along gender, along sexual identity, across lines of religion and immigration. We unite in order to build.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.